When this story broke, it stretched the imagination.
A 12-foot green monster with red glowing eyes had been seen on a mountaintop. One of the kids looked up and he said, "What on earth is that?" A pear-shaped, glowing red object which was pulsing. And one of the younger kids said a flying saucer was landed. Whilst a creature or a thing or an object about the size of a very heavy-set man, but obviously contained in some kind of suit.
So we start the program going back to the year that this happened.
At 7:15 p.m. on September 12th, 1952, in Flatwoods, West Virginia, two brothers, Edward and Fred May, were playing outside with their friend Tommy Heyer. It was a characteristically southern late summer evening that night, warm and accompanied by loud choruses of crickets, frogs, and cicadas to fill the night air with their songs. It was certainly beginning to get pretty dark, even getting closer to dusk. That special time of night when there's still a little bit of sunlight in the sky, but not enough to keep the brightness of the stars from showing up. As the boys played, suddenly an oval-shaped ball of fire roared across the night sky. Their racing minds immediately thought it was a flying saucer. They watched as it descended, following the trail of flames as it appeared to land or crash on a nearby local farm. The boys raced home and frantically explained what they had just seen to their mother, Kathleen May, who was immediately intrigued. She then recruited their National Guardsman neighbor, Eugene Lemon, to accompany her and the boys to the farm where this potential crash site would be. They were joined by two more local children, Neil Nunley and Ronnie Shaver, and Eugene Lemon's dog. Armed with flashlights, excitement, and a sprinkle of fear, the group headed out quickly to discover what exactly it was that had crashed. One of the first things they noticed as they approached the farm was the smell. They later described it as sulfur-like, a pungent mist that caused them to feel nauseated almost instantly. A strange mist began to rise up all around them as they made their way closer to where they calculated the crash site to be. As the group reached the top of a hill, a pulsing red light illuminated the late evening mist, and a metallic whirring sound filled the air. Eugene Lemon's dog ran away in fear into the mist that had now surrounded them. Lemon and the others ran after the dog, where they found it barking near a wooden fence. Although they wanted to keep moving forward, the dog refused to take another step. As they pushed forward anyway, the smell, odor, and noise became stronger and stronger. Suddenly, Lemon noticed a pair of eyes staring at him from the dark. He threw his flashlight onto the spot where he assumed he would see a possum. Instead, what they saw in the shadows of that farm would haunt them forever. He later described the being. "I aimed my flashlight in that direction, and in that moment saw this tall, man-like figure with a round, red face that was surrounded by a pointed, hood-like shape." Kathleen May said in her description,
"Well, when Gene's flashlight hit it, it lit up like a Christmas tree. We all noticed it, all at the same time. It wasn't in any bushes, it was right there, out in the open. Out in the roadway, the whole thing lit up instantly. It had small claw-like hands, clothing-like folds, and a head that resembled the ace of spades. It was a hideous sight, and I wish I'd not seen it.
Staring at them from within the darkness of the woods was the Flatwoods Monster. The witnesses all described the giant 10 to 12 foot tall, terrifying creature with a blood-red face and a green body that seemed to glow and had on what appeared to be a dark metal dress. Its hands were twisted and clawed, and what seemed to be its eyes glowed an eerie orange color. It began to make a loud hissing sound and started to glide toward the companions. Lemon screamed in terror and clumsily dropped his flashlight. His hands and body no doubt shaking with such fear, causing the rest of the group to panic and to run away as fast as they could muster. Before they could make their escape, however, the creature glided fast toward Kathleen and covered her in a strange, oily substance. Scared to death, the group ran down the hill back into town. Collecting their wits and attempting to stay calm, they immediately called the Braxton County Sheriff. They explained the strange encounter, even separately drawing sketches of what they had just seen. All the drawings were eerily similar. The sheriff was not at his station, however, because he had already been called out to investigate what another citizen reported as being a plane crash. When the sheriff and his deputy eventually arrived on the scene, there was no evidence of the creature. The mist was gone. There was no strange noise. National Guardsmen who were dispatched immediately to investigate that same crash later reported finding evidence of large parallel skid marks, track marks in the grass, an oily residue, and a rubber-like substance accompanied by a lingering strange odor. The witnesses reported that over the next several days, they were overcome with sickness, symptoms such as swelling of the nose and throat, vomiting, and convulsions that lasted several weeks. Many believers think the sickness might have been related to inhaling the strange mist. Several other locals would later report having seen the strange aircraft, separately from May and Lemon's group. And many people who claimed to come in contact with the strange creature as well. What was it these folks saw that night? Was it simply a meteor that crashed on a farm, accompanied by an angry owl perched on a tree that spooked this small group of townspeople? Or was it a strange alien creature in a metallic suit trying to communicate? Was it a robotic organism standing guard to protect its crashed ship and perhaps any other passengers within it? Perhaps we will never really know. That is, unless on a late autumn evening, just when the sun is dipped below the horizon, you happen to see a ball of flame crackle overhead and crash nearby, and you decide to go investigate for yourself. Welcome back, all you humans and space invaders, to your favorite podcast, That Would Be Rad, a podcast that majors in 80s and 90s nostalgia, comic culture, all things paranormal, and minors in retro video games, tabletop RPGs, pre-internet mysteries, and raising our kids to be half as cool as we were back in the 80s. We are your hosts, Woody Brown
and Tyler Bence.
Boy, howdy, brother. What did you think about that?
Well, first off, this is one of my all-time favorite entity or sightings or whatever, if you will. It's just such an amazing, when you think of the term high strangeness, for maybe all the new listeners who don't know what that is, high strangeness is sort of the idea of these things that are even more weird. You know, it's not just a UFO. I mean, the thing had a dress that basically looked like the afterburner, you know, on a jet, and it had a spade typed hood, metallic hood, and it's just really bizarre. So to me, this is the perfect example of high strangeness.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you brought up high strangeness, because whenever you first started getting me into this stuff, that was just a term that I kept on hearing on multiple podcasts, and I just never really knew what that was. And I was always kind of like, well, I don't want to be the, hey man, who brought this guy? You know, and be like, hey man, what's high strangeness?
Yeah.
You know? And so it's a term that you'll hear on multiple shows that kind of cover this type of stuff. And you know, just like you said, it's like all this stuff is, you know, whether it's paranormal or cryptid creatures or whatever, all of it's kind of strange enough, quote unquote strange, you know? High strangeness is taking it to that next level. It's like if, you know, Bigfoot is kind of just a strange tale in and of itself.
Right.
But if Bigfoot was flying a UFO to, you know, above Los Angeles or something, then it's like, oh man, that's next level. That is high strangeness. So when you hear us talk about that, that's what that is. Now you guys can kind of, you know, feel a little bit more educated today, because you know what high strangeness, or as we call it on our show, rad strangeness, is.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there's just so many elements to this story that it's funny. The reason why we decided to do this, the Flatwoods Monster, this week, is because you text me a picture of this really, really cool, I don't know, pin that had the Flatwoods Monster on it. And I was like, man, I know you've told me about this before, but what is it? And you kind of just barely described it. And I just looked it up, and I thought, oh my gosh, we have to talk about this. It's got all of the elements that it's got a lot of the elements of stories that I love, which is there's a group of friends or family involved. It's dark in the woods. It kind of reminds me again of that scene that we talked about last week's episode, that famous sort of just 80s scene where you're in the woods, there's a mist, there's bright lights, and there's just something really kind of terrific about this story. And you know, what's super intriguing about it too is it occurred in that special time, the 50s. Whenever I was a kid, the 50s I thought were super cool. You know, you had and I think a lot of it has to do with The Outsiders, both the movie and the book. But I was super into the greasers and that culture and just the 1950s in general, and just thinking about how simple sort of America is, right? At that time. And then you've got this almost explosion of activity that occurs kind of surrounding UFOs. I mean, you've got the Roswell stuff.
1947.
Right. And then that leads into, so we're still in the early 50s. Here's 1952. Since 47, there've been, you know, more and more sightings, people kind of talking about it. And, you know, interesting, one thing that kind of, I don't know, made me want to go visit West Virginia isn't Flatwoods, West Virginia, pretty close to where Mothman happened?
Yeah, Point Pleasant, where the Mothman sort of flap was, if you will. It's
Hold on. You got to explain what the heck a flap means, because I remember the first time you used that word, I'm like, I don't understand what you said.
Well, I think we did it. I think I explained on an early episode, but again, for all you new readers, new listeners, a flap is basically a sort of a limited sort of window of time where there's just a bunch of sightings, a bunch of reports kind of come in. So, you know, it's Well, for example, this is the perfect thing, and I don't know if you read this in your research, but
Yeah.
oddly enough, in 1952, it's affectionately called the Summer of Saucers, and it's the, I think, still the most consistent and the most like heavy amount of reports of these flying saucers in American history ever in 1952. So it's cool that like, this kind of falls in there. And then, so that would be a flap in 1952 or the summer, I guess. This was in September.
So it's like a concentration of activity
Right.
within a certain like time period.
Right. Like, and with, again, we'll do a real deep dive on Mothman because he's one of the heavy hitters as far as like the cryptids. He, that was a flap of, I think, a week or 2 weeks maybe, where people started seeing him. Some kids were like chased by this Mothman creature, and then the Silver Bridge collapse happened, and there's a ton that goes with that story. But anyway, yeah, this flap happened, and Point Pleasant is about 125 miles away. So basically, 2 hours down the road.
I mean, I think there's like a time gap between them, because at first, when I first started thinking about it, I thought, well, I know like the description of Flatwoods and Mothman aren't really that close in terms of characteristics and stuff, but this was something that just reminded me of it, that with like the glowing eyes, and, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and Mothman happened in 1966. So
yeah, one thing right out of the gate when I was learning about this story and stuff, I mean, one of the things that just really popped out to me was like, how cool was Kathleen May, the mom?
Oh,
right?
yeah, dude.
Like her kids come running in immediately. She's just like, grab your flashlights. I'm going to get this, their neighbor, Eugene Lemon. I think he was like, I know that he was in the National Guard, but nowadays when you think of someone in the National Guard, you're like, oh, okay, cool. Like some 30-year-old. No. This kid was like 19.
Right.
So he's like fresh, and he grabs a flashlight and his dog, and they just go out there. She wasn't like, oh, you kids are crazy. Come in and eat your supper. She was like, yep, let's go.
Yeah.
And I just thought like, I just picture this lady. She's in West Virginia. She's in the South in the early 50s, single mother, man. She just seems like a tough lady.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was really cool.
Yeah, and also again, I think this goes with this goes along well with the Summer of Saucers in 52. The idea that there's a theory. A lot of people believe that. Well, let me say this first. Just within that 24 hours of that day, there were 21 reports. The police were contacted, the newspaper, 21 reports of either people seeing what they believed were, a meteor was falling. Some people thought they saw a plane crashing. Other people one person saw like what looked like a red glowing bouncing ball in the sky. And so there's an idea that whatever this thing was, it was shot down by our military. And, that's what you saw. You saw the thing. It was shot out of the sky, it crashed, and then, this little hodgepodge group of people went to go check it out, and then, what they found was pretty terrifying.
And I mean, that's something that's, super fascinating to me, too, that all of these witness accounts didn't just happen in West Virginia. It kind of like follows a trajectory in other states and stuff. Almost like you could, if you look it up, hey, Tyler's making Jell-O over there.
I just drank a sip of water.
If you look it up, it's almost like a flight path.
Yeah,
a
flight path.
Flight path. I just said flight path.
Sylvia Plath.
Old Sylvia, which is really fascinating too. So it's not just concentrated in this small town, and if you're kind of on the skeptic side of things, you're thinking, well, these people could have just concocted this story and all this. It is another example of these folks had an actual encounter. They saw something, and then separate from them, other sides of town, other states, other whatever, things were seen.
Yeah, all the way up to like Maryland. And I ran across an account that happened the following night that is fascinating. Did you read that?
I think so, but go ahead. Yeah, I mean, tell us about this other encounter. And I almost added it into the thing because it's also terrifying.
Oh, yeah. To me, this is almost even more scary just because it's you don't have like a huge group and 3 dogs and all this stuff.
Right.
But basically, a guy named George and a guy and his wife, George and Edith Snetowski, and their 18-month-old son, they're driving along, and this is about 20.
Yeah, I remember. It's not in Flatwoods. It's actually like
it's like 20 miles away. Yeah, near Strange Creek. So basically, they're driving, and mysteriously, their car just totally quits. And 1952, super rural area, and your car,
no street lights.
Yeah, your car just goes dead, which is pretty scary. So George gets out, pops the hood. He's trying to see what's going on. He all of a sudden, like a mist or like a fog kind of rolls through. The baby starts crying. It's that same sort of noxious mustard gas kind of thing. George looks over and sees this bright light, up in the like kind of up over in the trees. It's about 10 foot tall. And then he realizes that what they're seeing is these glowing eyes, and it's this 10-foot tall creature sort of hovering towards him. Freaks out. He jumps in the car. But what was interesting about this story is
we will return after these messages.
America's future can be determined by our dreams and our visions.
It was very intense, bright light.
For over 200 years, there have been reports of giant man-like creatures
from another dimension, another world. I don't know.
The most intriguing mystery on the North American continent.
You're listening to That Would Be Rad.
Number one, there was no corroboration between this account and then what the other group saw the day before, which is fascinating.
They don't even live in the same town.
Not even the same people. But what's really interesting, especially if you look at it through the lens of like, okay, well maybe this thing was shot down and its craft is just crashed and it's kind of defending itself. Really, maybe the thing's 10 foot tall. It doesn't have the metallic like helmet on. They said it looked like a reptile thing. It had 3 fingers. So as it followed him, as he jumped into the car, it put its hand on the hood of his car, and it melted all the way through like the primer, the paint of like the hood of his car. It wasn't wearing the Spade type helmet thing, but it did still have that sort of like jet engine,
like dress.
Yeah, it's like the dress thing. But what would it be called on a jet? Why can I not think of it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, exhaust.
Yeah, it's kind of like the exhaust, like tube almost.
Like picture the bottom of like the old school space shuttle.
Yeah, right.
The 80s space shuttle, right? And that big like cone sort of shaped exhaust of the rocket.
Yeah. So this thing comes out. They all jump in the car. The baby's crying. They're both coughing and feeling, nauseated and stuff from this mist that is a real sort of common thread with both accounts. Comes out, drags its hand across the hood, melts the paint, and then just kind of like sort of, kind of hovers off back into the woods on the other side of the road. And then as soon as it's gone, as soon as it's sort of out of sight, oddly enough, their car cranks right back up and then they drive off, which is just, it's really amazing.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, I love the idea. I don't know, there's something about the idea that, the day before there's sort of all these sort of hypotheses about, oh, well, maybe it was like a robot. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that. But then like, because it had sort of this helmet on with these sort of glowing eyes. But then the next day they see this thing and it's sort of this reptilian type, really bony creature with, I think, 3 fingers. And it doesn't have its helmet on and all that stuff. It's just, it's pretty amazing. It's like it took its armor off or something,
Yeah, man. I mean, now, aside from those 2 sort of like visual encounters, did anybody else encounter the creature?
I didn't see anything.
I didn't find anything either. It was almost as if this was really, it kind of does lean more and more toward that sort of this creature or whatever is kind of, its craft was the one that got shot down or crashed or whatever. It's trying to figure things out, and then it figures it out and takes off.
Yeah, right.
And I think before we get into theories that we have about...
but before we move on, sorry to interrupt.
No, you're not.
But there actually was an account. I can't remember if it was in that following week. I do know that. I can't remember if it was like the following day or like the day after, but we'll just say week just to be safe. But there was a sighting of a glowing red light and then a craft going up, like shooting up. So that's even more fascinating if you look at like this, this sort of concept of like, this thing was shot down by our military, possibly, who knows. It was, working on its craft or whatever, if that's what was happening, and then it fixed it, and then boom, it shot back up.
Gosh. Yeah. So, I can't wait to get into like what our theories are, but I got to tell you that, that is easily becoming the one that I'm going to pick. But, one thing too, as I was kind of looking through this for us to kind of tell this story, that I noticed was apparently like the Air Force / National Guard were, immediately called out to investigate all the stuff that was going on.
Oh, yeah. Which is a really common occurrence back then.
And so, like, even so far as to, like, I think as soon as the Mays and Eugene Lemon, like, hauled butt out of there, the next up, before the sheriff got there, I think the Air Force, National Guard, all those folks, like, visited that crash site,
right?
Potentially,
and
maybe they scooped up all the stuff. Yeah. Maybe they got rid of it. I don't know, but
well, like in saying that, also, I think we should add that. This could be another Men in Black situation, which was highly prevalent in the or heavily prevalent with the Mothman stuff. They were constantly seeing all these, Men in Black suits, and again, like. Let's break this down. Everybody associates that with the Will Smith, movies, which is based off of...
Is that where Getting Jiggy With It comes from? No. There was a song in that movie, though, right?
Yeah, it was just called Men in Black.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it was... it wasn't quite like they're portrayed in those movies. They were usually these sort of bizarre characters who would just kind of show up, and they would gather this evidence, and then... nobody would ever see it again, which is exactly what happened here. The mom, Kathleen, was visited by these two men, black suits. I'm not sure if the term or the sort of idea of the Men in Black was even sort of in the lexicon at that time, but I kind of think that this is probably what they were, because she said that the one was talking to her while the other one was kind of acting erratic, and he just sort of disappeared off into the woods. And then when he came back, she said he was covered in head to toe almost with the oil that, that we heard that was like spewing out of the thing, which is, pretty wild. Yeah. And then they also said that the dress that she had, they, scraped off any and all sort of available sort of samples of it. And then... poof, I never heard about it again.
Yeah, and one thing that I came up with that I think is important to mention in this episode, and now kind of seems like a perfect time, is Project Blue Book.
Oh, yeah.
Now, prior to, this podcast, I had never even really heard of what Project Blue Book was. I had heard of it, like you mentioned it a bunch of times. And so I think it's important for our listeners to kind of maybe just hear about that. So, and let me just provide a little like context before we dive into that. Okay. So, like, you got to think this is like the nuclear age, right? We've got my dad. I remember my dad telling me about like they would do like nuclear bomb drills in their classrooms, at their elementary school.
Yeah,
like everybody get on your desk. Like that's gonna help you. And so, like, we've got a nation that's somewhat on edge. There's increased activity of UFOs. It's funny, like now, we talk about this a lot, and I'll just like send you articles, you send me articles. There's a lot of UFO activity right now, 2021.
Oh, yeah, man.
And then also more confirmation from government,
which
people who say like, no, that's real. And that kind of stuff is becoming declassified. It's coming out and all this kind of stuff.
But I'm also really skeptical of all of these sort of releases by the Pentagon and these sort of confirmations. Mm-hmm. It's just like, what's the motivation? Why are you suddenly coming out? I mean,
I think it's the slow.
I don't know, man, because
I think it's the slow release of information.
Yeah, but
to ultimately get us to the crazy. Do you remember the dude? Oh man, I think he wrote a book, but I think he retired like last year. He was head of like the Israeli.
Oh yeah, that was fascinating.
Whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he talked about like there being an actual like, not Starfleet, but like
full on
an organization that is like planetary and multiple like galaxy, like a galactic federation, basically.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes when I look at these kind of things, I'm like, well, I mean, maybe this is like the slow trickle. And like I said, I brought all that up to say, like, in the early 50s, oh man, there's UFOs around. Everyone's just panicking. Like, is this the Russians, or is this like, are we about to get nuked? What's going on? Nobody knows. Sprinkle in that with the fact that, we were probably testing new technologies, and so people were seeing things that were probably top secret, and maybe they weren't. There's all this stuff, and then that reaction, and then compared to like nowadays, we're kind of like, I mean, I don't know, maybe. It's just like it's just a different time.
Yeah.
So I think let's talk a little bit about what Project Blue Book is.
Okay, I'm kind of going off memory here, but Project Blue Book was, I think originally it was under the name Project Sign, and then Project Grudge, which was like the late 40s, I believe. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember if Sign came first or Grudge, but I want to say in 51 or 52. I can't remember. Early 50s.
Yeah, it's 50. It's 52. March 52.
Oh, so it's the same year as the.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
So 52. There's a famous UFO sort of researcher, a guy named J. Allen Hynek, and then another guy from the Air Force, and I never can remember his name.
Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. Ruppelt? I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I apologize, Captain. Carry on.
Well, they kind of got together and they were working. It was kind of a different time also. So a lot of this sort of secret stuff was all sort of projected, and it was sort of carried out through the Air Force. And so you had these guys who their whole job was sort of investigating sort of aerial phenomena and like just this concept of UFOs. And that actually makes sense now knowing that it was in 1952, especially because it was known as like the Summer of the Saucers, which is fascinating. Yeah. But these guys would like go around and sort of investigate these cases. And I wonder if, I didn't see anything in the research, but I wonder if they did go and investigate the Flatwoods Monster.
Yeah, I mean, what I saw was that, man, I don't know if those two guys specifically.
Yeah.
But I do remember there were some people that were involved with Project Blue Book that did come. Well, here's something that I found interesting too, because like it says Project Blue Book has had two goals, namely to determine if UFOs were a threat to national security and to scientifically analyze UFO-related data.
Well,
and I mean,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, it's pretty dang significant to me, man, that, like, I mean, there's that much activity, whether or not it was alien or whatever, but that there's that much stuff flying around the United States that the government created a dang organization that lasted from, it says, 1952 to, I think, 1969.
Yeah.
So it's like 17 years, right?
Yeah, pretty amazing.
I mean...
And also, I think it's cool to know that, to me, J. Allen Hynek is like the man. He is the quintessential sort of boots on the ground, early sort of nuts and bolts era UFOs. He's the guy. He's like the investigator guy. And so I know there was a series that came on, I think the History Channel. I've never really watched it. I watched a little bit of the first episode, but I never really followed up, so I'm sure it's awesome. But from what I know of J. Allen Hynek, he sort of started out as not really being a true believer at all. He was pretty skeptical, and then as it kind of went on and on and on, he started realizing, like, well, wait a minute, there's something to this. Like, there's and a lot. What's really cool too is, like, there's all these sort of cases, which is why I'm sure that they or somebody else from Project Blue Book investigated this, the Flatwoods Monster case. But it's cool because throughout the late 40s, throughout the 60s to the 70s, that was sort of like what's considered the nuts and bolts era, where, people see these UFOs, they see these sort of, bizarre 50s like sci-fi things coming out of crafts, and the crafts have like rivets and landing gear, and like you hear the door open and creak, and like, so very kind of like nuts and bolts physical things, whereas now it's a little different. It's a little more about like consciousness and this sort of interdimensionality kind of thing. But back then it was like, oh, these are real things that are showing up, and they're a threat. And so, but it's cool because throughout that time, J. Allen Hynek and I guess the Air Force guy was with him. I don't know if he was with him the whole time, but I mean, these guys were like showing up to every single one of these cases that are kind of famous, which is, I mean, pretty awesome.
This is something certainly separate from quote unquote Men in Black, or would they kind of, just because of the time, everybody wears, I mean, people wore wool suits to baseball games back then. Are they showing up in suits and people are thinking that they're the Men in Black, or is there any connection there?
Well,
okay. Potentially.
So some of the theories back in the day, some people did theorize that the Men in Black were sent from the Air Force. Because like I said, a lot of this sort of more fringe kind of stuff all this stuff was sort of conducted through the Air Force. And keep in mind, I mean, none of this was like public knowledge at all. I mean,
right.
We probably didn't even know about Project Blue Book until, someone like Stanton Friedman, who was another giant in the boots on the ground ufology investigation. The public, that wasn't public knowledge probably until way after it had already ended. But but no, and this is why I want to do like a full-on, maybe even 2 episode, sort of deep dive into the Men in Black, because, from what sort of a general kind of knowledge on what they are, you think of this like Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, and like you think of that, but like in reality, a lot of times they would show up and they would sort of have no sort of sense of like social cues. Sometimes like they wouldn't have lips, and they would have like lipstick like painted on lips.
What?
Like really bizarre stuff. They like there's one account where a lady offers that she had just made a bowl of Jell-O for her family, and she offers it to the Men in Black, and like the guy doesn't even know what to do with like the spoon, and it's just this sort of, there's so many cases where, and there's a guy named Nick Redfern who, he's an amazing writer, but he's done a lot of really huge stuff. He even wrote a book that's about like the Women in Black, which before he brought it up, I'd never heard of that. But yeah, basically there are these guys who show, and women who show up dressed, and everything about them is sort of out of time, so it kind of works. If they're showing up nowadays, it kind of works. If they were showing up in the late 40s, they had these sort of nondescript black suits, black tie, white shirt. A lot of times they were bald. A lot of times they would wear black glasses inside, which is another sort of weird thing. They usually would drive black, like these Cadillacs, which again at the time, more than likely that was probably the sort of government issue automobile. So. There's this theory that like, well, these things are actually alien or interdimensional or whatever, and they're just kind of sort of creating the same thing that like what the government would do. And that was another thing, they would show up and they would say, hey, we're from the Air Force or this committee or the this commission and we're here to get information. So they would always kind of ask questions and kind of lead off with like coming across like they were a government agency, which at the time, again, like we had such a huge trust in our government and a level of like patriotism that if somebody said they were from the government, it's like, okay, cool, I'll do whatever I can. Yeah. How can I help? And so that's why you have so many reports where if there were any sort of physical evidence, they would just hand it off and be like, sure, here you go. You know, and you'll get it back eventually. And of course, this disappears. One thing too that I should note is the Project Blue Book was done through Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is in Ohio. And that's actually the mythology of like the Roswell crash. Apparently they loaded up all the crash. They loaded up all the wreckage and all that stuff in a plane. I think they flew to Houston, and then from Houston that the airplane flew to Wright-Patterson. Then we never heard about it again. But there's a lot of sort of bizarre stuff, even, you know, if you really look into like ufology and stuff like that, there's a ton of stuff, sort of mythology around Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Man.
Yeah. Boy, I went way, way off the rails.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I think it's kind of hard to avoid getting into the sort of the government organizations that exist to investigate this kind of stuff. I mean, I'm still, like I said earlier, I'm fascinated by the fact that there was so much stuff going on that we had to have these organizations in place. Now, one thing that I kind of found too was that so apparently I think some government officials talked to Kathleen May.
Yep.
You know, she also did like a TV interview. There's a famous picture of her holding up this really cool drawing of the Flatwoods Monster and stuff, and we'll put that in our artifacts post because it's really, really cool.
Is that the one where it shows like I guess for scale, it shows like a guy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
Which, dude, this thing is huge.
Yeah, it's humongous.
That's terrifying.
Huge thing. And, you know,
it's like a transformer.
Yeah. Apparently, she received a letter from the Pentagon. Now, I tried to find this. You know, I was just hoping, hopefully there'd be like a scan of this online, like a PDF I could get. But apparently she received a letter from the Pentagon about this event saying that, we've done our investigation. Essentially, it was, hey, good news. It was just basically like a failed military training exercise. You know, the classic thing that we see, training exercise gone wrong. And so I found that to be interesting because then it's kind of like, well, wow, okay, so this is a training exercise. I'm not sure why we never heard any of that. All right.
Well, and I'm actually surprised that, you know, this is something that is tied into like the Project Blue Book is I think when they first started, like I said, you know, J. Allen Hynek was a pretty huge skeptic when they first started. And I had heard that he really regretted saying a lot of this stuff later, you know, once he started kind of coming around and like believing that, hey, no, there's more to it. But, you know, he was one of the ones who started giving the conclusion as swamp gas, ball lightning, military exercise, weather balloons. You know, it's just this cheesy thing that just, God, I mean, it's such a slap in the face to these situations.
But hey, I mean, they used it though because people, like you said, had this like, you know, almost like naive sort of, I'm not saying there's respect for the government.
It was like a trust.
Naive, but I'm just saying, there's like, you know, there's like, okay, whatever, they accepted it. And I think that kind of goes perfectly into the next sort of part that I wanted to talk about, which is like, what were some of the quote unquote explanations of what potentially this could have been, if not extraterrestrial or, you know, other dimensional or anything like that.
Yeah.
One of the first things I read out of the gate was, it was just a meteor that, which, you know, again, that is plausible, but who's to say that a craft can't be what looks like a meteor? Also, when things enter our atmosphere, even our own astronauts, you know, they burn up in the atmosphere, their craft does, you know. It's surrounded by like that ball of flaming hot plasma as it enters the atmosphere. Yep. But the thing that kind of just like made me, I don't know. I don't want to say angry because like we've all been in that spot in our lives probably where we're somewhere strange or, even in the woods, it's maybe in the middle of the night and you hear a noise and your mind kind of plays tricks on you or whatever. But the explanation that people have for this is, it was just like a barn owl on a tree branch, right?
Unbelievable.
And I think they use that animal because they can, kind of explain the screeching sound that they heard. They can kind of explain, the idea that this thing was like hovering, coming at them. And I understand, like owls in the wild can be pretty freaky.
Oh,
my family, we encountered a bard, that's B-A-R-D, owl, on a camping trip one time that scared us to death, dude.
Oh, yeah.
This thing started making a noise in the middle of the night while my mom, my dad, my brother, and I were sleeping in this tent, and it sounded like a woman was being, like, killed.
Yeah, yep.
In the middle of the night. And so, like, I get it, but I don't know.
Yeah, I will say when we first built our house in this neighborhood that we're in now, and also actually at the beginning of this episode it was doing it, and I don't know if it's the same owl, but like it like hoots during the day, which I've always heard that was bad luck. I didn't even know that owls did that during the day, but every single time we record episodes, you can hear it,
Now, is it an owl or do you think it's like does it sound like this? Hold on. Like that?
Yes.
Okay, that is it's not an owl.
What is it?
It is oh God, what's it called?
Oh, easy, Flatwoods Monster.
Yeah, it's the Flatwood Monster. I don't remember what it's called. It's like it's not a dove. It's it's something else. It's not an owl. Keep going.
Okay. Well, now I got to look into that. But when we first moved in,
how'd you like my sound?
Did you do it with the bottle?
No. That's I do that with my tongue, man. I curl my tongue. I'm doing it now. Hold on. Whoops-a-daisies. That's just the whistle.
Sorry about that.
Let's move on.
No, this thing would fly over our house, like across. It would fly like across the sort of the little road, in the neighborhood from one side, and then over our house off into the woods, because the back of our house faces like the woods. And dude, we caught it one day, and this thing, I mean, they are massive, like huge. I mean, this thing, the wingspan would have, it was literally probably almost 5 foot wide. I mean, huge. But yeah, I just think the idea that, it's just so condescending to me. It's like, oh, it's just an owl. I do not get it. Okay, so if it's an owl, then how do you explain like the
metal skirt,
the metal skirt, the oil that was like gushing out of this thing that got all over the woman's dress as she's running, the eyes that like once they shine the flashlight. Well, first they said I think one of the boys, something caught his eye up in what looked like it was sort of up in the trees, which and again, that would explain like, okay, well, maybe it was an owl up in the tree. But then once they shined the flashlight on it, the eyes lit up, and they said it was as bright as the sun almost. Like, and then they realized like, no, this thing isn't in the tree. This thing is that tall, and it started kind of hovering toward them. It's just so ridiculous. What were some of the other?
Obviously, we think, that's basically it, like maybe there's some sort of, when the meteor crashed, it caused some sort of like gas or something to be released from the dirt that caused there's all the other stuff that goes along with it, like the sickness that lasted weeks and, all these kind of things that don't really, and then, well, now I kind of want to talk about like, well, obviously Tyler and I both think that theory that it was just an owl is just
total BS.
A bunch of hooey
malarkey,
or whatever you want to call it. Malarkey. But one of the things about this story too that I thought of kind of after the fact, like if you remove obviously it's occurring in a high stress situation. These folks are going to be terrified. I would have been terrified. I think, listener, I think you would have been terrified.
Oh yeah.
But I remember when we first talked about Sam, the Sandown.
Oh my God!
Ghost Clown.
I'm so glad you said this.
I don't know if you remember, but my wife Anne had an interesting take on it when she heard the story. Whenever I, told it to her,
sort of sympathetic.
Yeah, like more of like a sympathetic thing. And so when I, thinking like this is just sure it's a creature from who knows where.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to communicate. It's not trying to harm these people. I mean, really, as evidenced by nobody got harmed. I mean, they had sickness and stuff, but that might not have been, their fault. I mean, the creature's fault.
Mm-hmm.
If you're by an exhaust, you're not going to feel too great anyway. And so, like, think about it in those terms. And this thing's like, maybe trying to get help from these people. It hovers over to them, and maybe it's got like a, like an injury or something, and that's what this stuff is. That's kind of bleeding onto
like the oil.
Yeah,
stuff,
man.
Yeah.
And so, like, if you think about it and through that light, it's kind of like, oh, man, you kind of feel sorry for this creature. Here it is. It's like its ship's crashed, doesn't know how it's going to, it's just terrified because I'm sure it thinks it's just going to get hurt by these people who are going to be scared of it or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just trying to, like, figure things out. But, yeah, I mean, it also reminds me, in a way, kind of that same sort of metallic, otherworldly, other dimensional kind of being. Mm-hmm. Kind of like Sam. This is Sam's mother? I mean, does he got a skirt on? I mean, I don't know.
Well, dude, I'm so glad you brought that up. I think we've said this before, but like, Jacques Vallée created this sort of theory of like, this called the interdimensional hypothesis, where, there's this idea that there's these beings that aren't really coming from Mars. They're not really coming elsewhere. They're just coming from a different dimension. And so he calls them ultra-terrestrials. And like, to me, there's so many sort of points about this story that reminded me of Sam, like just the bizarre, the weird like dress, that was sort of like an engine, the hovering, the tiny little, 3-fingered like arms and hands, the weird like spade helmet and like the glowing eyes. Like there's just so many things about this that are just totally sort of unexplainable, just like, Sam the Sandown Clown. Speaking of also, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the guys over at BCC, Bigfoot Collectors Club, I was so psyched to see that they finally did an episode on Sam the Sandown Clown, because that was the story that I had ran across it, and I was so excited because it was something that we had never heard of. And this was before we even started our podcast, and Woody and I both were like, man, this is insane, which eventually led to that story was one of the reasons that we decided to start a podcast, because we just had to go into it. But I immediately sent this to the guys at BCC, or I sent it to Michael, and like almost 2 years ago, I guess now. So it was really good to see that they finally tackled it, and I think they did a great job.
Yeah, man, I think they did awesome.
But yeah, I think there's definitely elements of both of those stories that are just,
in a way, kind of similar, right? I mean,
yeah.
And like more and more that we do these, and the more that we kind of dig in and kind of get all these details, the more and more I'm starting to lean. And I remember when we first started this podcast, I was like, no, I don't know about that sort of interdimensional stuff. But man, I mean, it's one of those explanations that kind of, to me, makes the most sense. I think let's talk a little bit about...
You want to get into like theories?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about like what you think. I mean,
Go ahead, you kick it off.
I was going to say, like, one of the things as we were like kind of, as I was researching about this and stuff, that kind of stood out to me was there's this really great documentary that you can watch. It's streaming on Amazon Prime right now.
Yeah. It's called Small Town Monsters. It's in the Small Town Monsters.
I think it's called The Flatwoods Monster, A Legacy of Fear.
Yeah.
And this guy that does these Small Town Monsters...
Seth Breedlove.
Yep, Seth Breedlove. He's the director. He did this documentary, and what the most intriguing part about it really is that he interviews Ed May and Fred May.
Yeah.
And so you get to see these gentlemen, they're older guys now, obviously, and they kind of talk a little bit about what they think about it. And, in a way, it's a very intriguing documentary because they do talk a little bit about, man, I wish, I kind of wish this never would have happened because, they didn't really like the attention that it brought to their family.
Oh, yeah.
In especially on the negative side of things. A lot of, obviously some folks would just, be rude to them in a way, kind of ostracized. And, so that's kind of sad.
Which is pretty common on
right. Well, I mean, just
100% of these cases.
One of the things that was kind of intriguing to me is both of the brothers basically said, look, I think now that what we saw that night was just some sort of metallic robot type thing. They didn't really make it sound like they believed it to be like an organic creature, but more of this robotic thing. One of the brothers said that he really thought maybe it was sort of like a sentry, almost like a sentinel, just standing guard,
protecting something.
Right, because it was essentially where they saw this creature and where the crash site was, it was essentially blocking their path to where the crash was. And so they think maybe this thing was, even if it was a robot or whatever, it was there standing guard to keep them from going to the crash. So perhaps this being really was there protecting something, much more fragile.
Wow.
In that craft, So I thought, man, that's wow, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. My kind of theory was, I do like that. I like the idea that there's it's like a sentry sort of protecting something, and if you look at it as, okay, there was this sighting of this glowing red object that was kind of bouncing in the sky. That's how they sort of phrased it. It looked like it was bouncing. So what if this thing did crash on the 12th, September 12th, and then, you see, maybe, again, I don't know when the date was for this, but say the sighting of the bouncing thing happened later that night or even earlier the next night, and what it was doing was it was taking off, but because it was bouncing, maybe it crashed again 20 miles away, and that's when the other little family, their car went dead and they saw it again. One thing that I thought is the idea that nobody ever really saw the actual craft. So, and again, if you're looking at it and while adding the second story of the next night where, it has the helmet off and it's sort of this reptilian looking creature, maybe the craft was basically this sort of Iron Man armor, because it was able to hover, and maybe that was the craft. It crashed and its armor was damaged or whatever. Or, originally, I think my thought was, and with me, it's kind of all things lead to interdimensional and all that. And maybe it did. I mean, maybe all these sightings, these UFO sightings around the area, maybe that was something totally different. And maybe this did just sort of phase into our reality or our dimension. But the more and more you hear about it, the more it does feel kind of like a nuts and bolts sort of thing. Which, I mean, it could still be interdimensional, but I do believe that there was a suit. I think it was sort of a corporeal, materialistic sort of situation. I think it was really there. It wasn't just sort of this floating, glowing kind of thing. I think it was a real, whatever it was, a
physical.
Yeah, it was a physical being in some sort of suit, which is wild.
Yeah, for sure.
So do you think that it was interdimensional, or do you think it was sort of the classic?
Man, I don't know.
Space
I don't know, because I mean, in so many different ways, I like the idea of both. I love the idea. Well, I say I love. I mean, obviously, whenever we think of other beings visiting our planet, we always think of them doing so in some sort of malicious intent,
right.
And I don't really like to think about that. I think you and I have talked about this. I'm not sure if we've mentioned it on the show, but I'm not a huge fan of, especially now as a dad, thinking of anything that is just going to come and destroy, and I have zero control over. At least fighting back is just not fun.
Yeah.
But so I like to think of it being almost more like a an observational type thing, whatever. And then at the same time, I like the idea of, or it's equally entertaining to me, the idea of multi-dimensional travel and different creatures from different dimensions and stuff. I think for me, believe it or not, it's easier for me to wrap my head around it being from outer space.
Like a classic sort of.
Because I can almost like I can wrap my head around the fact that the physics exist for that to occur in terms of space travel. And, as our technology is getting better and better and better, it's just easier for me to digest mentally. So,
and it kind of supports the idea of our military, our jets, maybe it's in some sort of dogfight, and that's how it was.
Or just especially back then, dude, I bet the first reaction from the Air Force isn't like, hey, we're trying to hail them on the comm system. No. They're just like, we don't know what it is. Shoot it down.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly, dude.
Yeah.
But even if it was a craft from another dimension, same thing. I mean, the military would just be like, I don't know, shoot it down,
Which would also, this kind of supports just the regular Air Force guys coming out. It's like, how did they know? Who told them?
And how quickly they were organized, man.
Right.
Like in that documentary, it talked about we're talking not just 3 or 4 people from the National Guard. We're talking I think close to 100 troops.
Yeah, it was 60 to 100 troops.
Yeah, man. Obviously, they thought something weird was going on, and it wasn't. It wasn't us.
Yeah.
So all in all, man, it's super interesting. What's cool is, gosh, man, West Virginia, especially after my recent road trip, West Virginia isn't that far from us, and so I'm definitely putting a pin in us making a road trip out to Flatwoods.
I would love
checking it out ourselves. On location. That would be incredible.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, man, just the creature itself, and maybe it's just because we just did this, I have a feeling all of these weird things are going to start becoming my quote-unquote favorite. But right now, man, Flatwoods is pretty close to the top. I mean, I think I'm into this Flatwoods guy, man. He's pretty cool.
Yeah, he's amazing. We haven't reached out yet, but there's they make these pins. There's this company called Fauna Obscura Shop on Etsy. And like I said, we haven't reached out yet, but I think we're going to try to figure out maybe a way to do a giveaway, because they have this pin of the Flatwoods Monster that just says, "Going to the woods is going home." And man, it's cool. They have some amazing
really
stuff.
Awesome.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I love it too, man. I think I've always loved this story, but doing this sort of deep dive for the episode, I'd never heard of I always thought it was just the one kind of account. I didn't realize that it was during the Summer of Saucers era. I'd never heard of the sort of the encounter that happened the following night with that family on the road. So it's really cool. And I mean, man, what a time to be alive.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, like we kind of mentioned earlier, UFO activity is increasing and increasing and increasing all around us. So I think the important thing, everybody, keep your eyes up.
Yep.
Take a look. Go outside. Now, let me ask you this real quick.
Give it to me,
Let's say you see something, and I think this is God bless, I keep on kicking my mic stand here. If a fireball flew over your head, you're outside, you're hanging out with your family, maybe you're doing a little fire pit, whatever. Fireball just comes, just flying overhead, and you see it crash. Are you going to investigate, or are you like, everybody get inside?
Well, first I'm going to tell everybody else to go inside, and I'm definitely going to investigate. However, I don't know that I would get out of the car.
Yeah, right.
I don't love the idea of the Travis Walton situation of getting out and then being just sucked up into a craft or,
yikes,
anything like that. But I'm definitely going to go to try to.
Well, let's assume that you can't drive to the site. You have to walk there. It's in the woods.
Man, that's
you
tough.
going to check it out? I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
I mean, I would like to say yes. I feel like I have pretty good discernment, so
I feel like I could beat up an alien,
Well, no, I mean, I've sometimes you just get the vibe that there are just some nights where you'll walk outside and there's just a vibe that something's kind of off, or there's other nights where you feel fine and you could walk around and all that. But
is it bad or good that I always have that vibe? Quick answer.
That it's like
that I'm just like, oh gosh, something.
Oh, scary. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to say I would go try to check it out. Yeah. Definitely probably have a gun.
I would definitely let you. I think this is a perfect time to kind of wrap it up. I know this is such an intriguing story. I encourage everybody to go check out that documentary for sure.
Mm-hmm.
There's plenty of podcasts that have talked about this story before, but the documentary itself, I think, does a really good job of kind of putting the visual, obviously, behind it, but also gives you that chance to kind of see Fred and Ed May and talk about it. And then there's some like local folks that live in Flatwoods now that kind of give some more kind of context and stuff. And so I think it's a very, very well done. So I encourage everybody to kind of, dive into that and check out Flatwoods Monster. And as always, kind of just let us know what you think about it. Do you think it could have been an owl? I've seen a drawing that, they kind of diagram how the owl could have looked like. Let us know what you think.
I've never seen a 10-foot tall owl, but...
the drawing that I saw had the owl perched on a branch, and then underneath it, there was like some shrubbery, I guess you could call it. And again, this is just a depiction. They don't have a picture of it. They don't have, they don't have the iPhone out trying to take a picture in the middle of all that swamp gas. Now, swamp gas is a nickname we gave a friend in high school who we always sat in the back of the soccer bus and... anyway, week after week, we say it every single time, but we're never going to stop saying it, just how grateful we are that we have people that listen to our show, people that interact with us every day to talk about some of the things that, they found, things that they think we'd be interested in, and just to kind of talk about the things that we discuss on this podcast.
Yeah.
So, like we say all the time, thank you guys so, so much, because not only does it make our day, but it also just really kind of solidifies our reason for doing this podcast.
Right.
Now, Tyler, where is the best place for people to interact with us?
Well, most of the time we're over on Instagram, so feel free to hit us up there. You can shoot us DMs. Feel free to comment. There's always like a lot of good back and forth. Like what he said, if you have a spooky story or an encounter, or you've seen the Flatwoods Monster yourself, or a 10-foot tall barred owl, feel free to send us a more long-form accounts or stories, I guess, over to our email at thatwouldberadpod@gmail.com. Yeah, like what he said, we kind of started this podcast, we understand that it's a pretty broad podcast. We talk about paranormal one week, the Ewoks the next week, toys from the 80s one week, the D&D the next. And so we understand that it's pretty broad and it's hard to kind of put your finger on like what we're all about, but it just so happens we love all that stuff equally. And we knew when we created the podcast that surely there's more people out there that are like us, that have that same kind of 80s nostalgia and love for these things. Not all of them, but maybe one or two here and there. And so, we're so happy, and we're so, it really kind of makes us feel fulfilled for what we're doing when you guys do hit us up or give us suggestions of, hey, you guys should cover this, or hey, have you heard about this? That's just really, really cool to us, and it really means a lot. So, we love you, we appreciate you, and as always,
be rad.
That's the way it goes. My favorite song on the radio. sunshine. You were already dead, for you became a ghost. You always said our future